everyone. Thank you very much for coming out tonight on a cold and rainy evening. And welcome to Gillingham, the birthplace of Rosemary Tonks. The format of the evening, I'm going to give a bit chat about the 6 women who we're celebrating tonight. As you can see here, some splendid pictures from Nicole Mollett's fine murals, which are available to view for at least the next year. If you go into Jeffrey Street, they're on the blue hoardings opposite the Monarch pub. So I would definitely recommend going to view them. They are beautiful. And Nicole is going to be giving a talk later on this year. She's going to be giving a talk about Tirzah Garwood, the artist. Definitely recommend that. So the Circle of 6 is an Arts Council funded project to raise awareness about the work and the impact of 6 extraordinary women who have a close personal connection to Gillingham. Now, who are these 6 women? Well, I'll introduce them. We have the suffragist and peace campaigner Kathleen Courtney. We have the African princess and friend to Queen Victoria, Sarah Forbes Bonetta. We have the pioneering psychiatrist, Dr. Lorna Wing, who came up with the phrase, the spectrum of the autistic spectrum. We have Rosemary Tonks, who we're going to hear about tonight. She's in the bottom right-hand corner. Inventor and engineer Verena Holmes, and the artist Eileen, otherwise known as Tirzah Garwood. So let's talk about Rosemary. She was destined for greatness, and I mention this one as something that only locals will know. She was born a very short distance away from a place known locally as Poets' Corner, and that's in Gillingham, where Byron Road and Shakespeare Road meet. And as a lovely piece of post-war planning, a lot of the roads are named after poets. So we have Milton Road, Chaucer Road, Cowper Road, Tennyson Road, and Longfellow Road. So that's a little bit of trivia that not many people know. So the 6 women, my project is a culmination of over 10 years of work and research. And it was originally inspired by the 2012 Olympics, because connected to that we had the Cultural Olympiad, where we had lots of cultural events going on, and what an inspiring time that was. And I wanted to find out people from Medway who basically weren't Charles Dickens. I know, so yeah, I mean, bless him, he's an interesting chap, but we know enough about him. Kathleen Courtney, who was the only one I found out about anything, but we had nothing local. And it's only over the years that we've gradually found out about these women. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a talk about her life, but also remember we're going to have a couple of creative writing workshops, and Sam is going to talk about that in a moment. What I particularly like about Rosemary is the fact that she's a woman of integrity and courage. And here's a quote for you from her. The British Council in 1963 interviewed Rosemary, and this is something she said about her work. Although my poems are a bit dark in spirit at the moment, I want to show people that the world is absolutely tremendous. And this is more important than making notes on even the most awful contemporary ills. One wants to raise people up, not cast them down. Or if you are going to write of these desperate things, then you must put them in their context and show the other side of the picture. This is very much duty, isn't it? And that's what I really like about her writing. She has that intensity, but she doesn't want to wallow. So, I would just like to say that Neil Astley from Blood Axe Books played a key part in the choosing of our women for this project, because he tracked down an awful lot of information about Rosemary Tonks. And because of him, I chose Rosemary for our event. And he's done an awful lot to raise awareness about her and her work. So, I would just like to introduce Sam Rapp, who is going to speak briefly about Creative Medway. She's co-chair of Creative Medway, and she has been a tremendous help in setting up this project. Sam?
Thank you, Sarah. Round of applause for Sarah. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending, and thank you to Sarah and to Medway Libraries for this amazing project. So I'm a local writer, I'm co-chair of Creative People, and Co-Yoda, I'm not sure what that means, but it's something from Star Wars, but I don't think I look like someone from Star Wars, hopefully not anyway. The creative process started about 2.5 years ago with a number of open space consultations with a diverse cross-section of Medway's community who are shaping creative and cultural delivery for creativity as a whole in Medway. The Creative Congress is a broad group made up of different sections, and I'll get to that in a minute, but it's open to all interested in culture in Medway. So it's everyone here, everybody involved, to receive information, invitations to activities. We have meetings to reflect and plan activities moving forward, looking at by 2030, we want everybody to be included in the creative process in Medway. So there's a number of themes. There's connectivity, which connects all of Medway, local businesses, local talent, new talent, existing talent, and it's projects like this where the community comes together. So there's also community engagement, reaching out to the community to look at the whole community in terms of art and culture. Spaces, we're looking at spaces in terms of inclusion and accessibility for everybody. It's an amazing project to be part of. So it's projects like this where the libraries are so fundamental for our communities, and cultural and creative Medway, which brings the whole community together as inclusion, diversity, disability, equality is the heart of what we do. The Circle of Six is an amazing project, and I'm so proud to be part of it. It showcases the positives and the inspirational women that Gillingham can celebrate. We've looked at Sarah Forbes Bonetta, Kathleen Courtney, now the amazing work, we're going to hear from Jeremy in his fantastic talk, and Lizzie in her reading of the works of this fantastic, amazing woman, Rosemary Tonks. If you haven't read her work, I would really suggest you do, because it's amazing. And I'm now hooked on it. I've started to learn and read quite a lot about this amazing woman. So, as the Circle of Six holds events throughout the year, the library would like your input to celebrate and highlight the women that make up this project. So we're calling out tonight for writers, poets, storytellers, people who are new to writing, have never written anything, just come and talk to us and please write for us. Because what we're doing is that the work will be put in a book. We will be selecting from a panel, and the work will be put in a book as an existing legacy of the Circle of Six Women and this project. So it doesn't matter whether you're published, whether you just write with an X, it doesn't matter. Please contact us and submit. So in effect, we want you, okay? So it doesn't matter if you're 8 or 108, you can do it. So we want your original work on the theme of the 6 women, whether you write about all 6 women or write about one, whether you're interested in Verena Holmes, Rosemary Tonks, or the Suffragettes with Kathleen Courtney, and any of the other women we are highlighting. This is about your creativity as to how you wish to express your work. You will be invited in due course to perform or read your poems at an event. That's obviously optional. Not everybody wants to do this, but we'd love to hear your work. We will introduce the book by way of history of the project, and your work will be in this book as an ongoing legacy to highlight the 6 women and the details of the submissions and how you can obtain this will be going out this week. This project, of course, cannot happen without the libraries. It can't happen without the people who come to the libraries. It can't happen with the people like Sarah and all the people who come and join in. So I thank you, we all thank you for attending tonight. And I hope that you enjoy the life and work of Rosemary Tonks. And the final thing before I shut up is the workshop. The first workshop will be this Saturday, all about the work, life and poetry of Rosemary Tonks at Gillingham Library from 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock. So if you want to just drop in and drop out, please do so. But please come along, it's going to be fun. And as I've said, I've learned a lot about Rosemary Tonks and she's fantastic. So if you want to get involved, please do. There is a website, Medway culturalstrategy.co.uk, creative Medway, if you want to get involved in the creative side of Medway and join us in terms of the project there. And obviously the library website and email address is on the leaflets, I believe, for the Rosemary Tonks workshops and if you want to submit your work. So please do so. So thank you very much.
So I would just like to introduce Jeremy Clarke to you. Jeremy works as an education officer for Medway Council's Heritage Team and is based at the marvellous Guildhall Museum in Rochester.
In the room with the watermark as rich as sago on the wall, the young head of a minx asleep sheds on cheap linen the pale silk hair of baby Kensington. An apricot fabric hanging in wads lightly grimed admits morning. The furnishings have picked themselves clothing as country bushes with hooks are able to dress from passing children. A tumbler of green beach glass with some spillings, bright water ovals firm on dust, is the bedside comfort. Against hair and sheet, the mesmerised face is very slightly active. Paint burns from yesterday's gouache are healing on the mouth. It passes some great supernatural illness with the zither of a little healthy breath. The shorthand typist at 17. On either side of warm nostril, she presses crossly to her cheek the stiff gilt lashes of a court page. In the underframe of the window, beading records a lorry from the world, buzz of a giant cello string. A chest of drawers take the itch of the infection. Streets have begun. Good evening, everybody. Welcome, of course, to Gillingham. Welcome also to the world of Rosemary Tonks. It's 1960s London. We are young. We are exhausted. We might be hungover or out of it, or both. We are essentially alone. Somebody might be dreaming, but whether it's the person in the poem, or the poet, or the reader, is not entirely clear. We are definitely at the centre of all things. We seem to be a very long way from pre-war Gillingham. So that was the first half of Bedroom in an Old City. I'm really pleased to be here with you this evening. I do a lot of this kind of thing, talking to audiences, but a lot of my engagement practice is all about versions on a theme. It's very rare that I have the chance to come at something completely fresh, and that's exactly what I'm doing this evening. Before I agreed to do the talk, I had never come across Rosemary Tonks' work at all. I didn't know anything about it, and so it's been a huge adventure, and I'm delighted to be able to share a bit of it with you tonight. So how am I going to play it? Well, I think we're here for two reasons. First one, of course, is that we're dealing here with a notable writer. She was in Philip Larkin's Oxford Book of 20th Century Verse. And you don't get in that unless you're pretty good at what you do. And she also wrote a lot of other material as well. So I wanted to give you an idea, first of all, of the kind of stuff I'm drawing on to try to give you a picture of her life and work this evening. So 6 novels, written in an amazing burst of creativity in the mid to late 60s and the early 70s, and children's books too. I'm delighted to re-emphasise what Sarah said. The Bloater, as you can see, is just been republished, so you can now get hold of that very easily. It's published in Vintage Classics, so her work, her prose work, is now accessible again. She wrote children's books. For sake of completeness, I put in The Wild Sea Goose there, but it is the one I haven't read. I have read all the others, the ones not yet published, not yet republished in the British Library. Hopefully, who knows, they will also appear soon. She also published 2 books of poetry. You can see from the dates that she really was very, very busy in the 1960s and very successful. And as Sarah has already mentioned, the wonderful thing is that both of these books are now collected in the easily available Bedouin of the London Evening. And it's been published with a really interesting introduction by Neil Astley, the editor of Blood Axe. And I have to say that I suppose I could have got something together this evening to talk to you about Rosemary Tonks, but this talk would not have been anything like, would not have anything of the authority that it might have this evening without Neil Astley's introduction. It's really, really useful and interesting. I thought I would also mention that she, with the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, she also produced Sono Montage. I think it was originally performed for the Hampstead Festival, but she recorded a radio programme, which I've also listened to in the British Library. It is a fantastic period piece, and it's probably, I have to say, interesting enough to stretch a little bit beyond that, where she reads her own work, but also other readers read other poets' work to the sound of all kinds of bells and whistles in the background. So we're here because she was a major 20th century writer. But of course, we're also here because of this. She was born down the road. There. Now, I think probably we're on slightly shaky ground if we go too far towards understanding a writer's work by using their life to do so. But right at the top, I want to make something really clear. There is a great deal of tension between the material in Rosemary's life and what ends up in her work. If we just take the 6 novels on their own, the protagonists in all of them are young women, like Rosemary was when she wrote them. One of those protagonists is an actual poet. Another one is a sound artist. In fact, there are poets all over the books. The action mainly concerns London, and one actually takes place in Hampstead, where she lived in London. In Opium Fogs, her first book, one of the major characters has just returned from India, where she was incredibly ill, just like Rosemary Tonks was. Another gets polio, like she did. Another character in another book struggles with huge and troubling grief over the death of her mother, which Rosemary did. Another has been to a ghastly boarding school, just like Rosemary. Another explores in-depth Sufi mysticism, like she did. And yet another has a life-changing experience by going to see a clairvoyant, like she did too. So, although I'm not going to attempt to psychoanalyze her through her work, you can see that right at the start there is a real creative tension going on here. In 1963, in an interview, she said, "You either read and you give talks and you become a public person, or else you write consistently and every day and think on a certain level." The life is always getting in there, demanding attention. And I think she always felt that. Art for her was definitely a matter of processing the life. So Min, the major character in The Bloater, says, "I have this tendency to boil down my whole past life into a sort of beef essence before I can begin anything new." But sometimes we get the feeling that her characters need the world just because it's the world. So Sophie, in her final book, says, "I was tired of gluing on false eyelashes and I wanted reality." So what I want to do is, I think we need to be aware of both. I think we need an outline of her life to understand where she was coming from, but then what I want to do is to try and pick out for you some of the major themes in her work and why I think she is important. So to start with, the life. She was born in the Larkfield Nursing Home, Junction Road, according to the Register of Births. We don't think she was baptised in Gillingham. And one of the reasons for that is that already, before she even emerged into the world, one of the critical events in her life, certainly in her early life, had already happened. Her father had died. Her father was an engineer, and he died of blackwater fever, which is a complication of malaria, in Nigeria. So Rosemary never knew him, he never knew Rosemary. Now, of course, apart from any direct influence he might have had on the young Rosemary, there was a massive indirect impact on Rosemary's early life, mainly, of course, through her mother. Now, Neil Astley, in writing his introduction to Bedouin of the London Evening, he has access to a large number of Rosemary's notebooks, which of course are not published. But using those, he is able to paint us a picture of a very disrupted childhood. Her mum and her moved loads and loads of times, again and again and again. She seems to have spent time in children's homes when her mother simply couldn't cope. She had eye problems, persistent eye problems throughout her life, but they were already an issue when she was a very young child. She was eventually sent away to boarding school in Bournemouth, but she left at 16. Now, according to a Guardian interview, which was published in 1970, she claimed she was expelled, which reminds me of a conversation in The Bloater, where Min is talking to her friend Jenny. Min thinks to herself, "I keep asking myself, am I an absolute worm? Surely if I'm so worm-like, they wouldn't have sacked me from school. I once told Jenny about it and she said, 'But what were you expelled for?' Pfft, reforming the syllabus, stealing tomatoes, gang warfare, just nothing." So it's possible, as on many occasions in her work, that is a little bit of biography slipping in there, although maybe the age of 16 might suggest she was slightly exaggerating the situation. Perhaps they parted by mutual consent, as they say, the school and her. In 1946, the young Rosemary and her mother appear on this docket, travelling to Lagos to join her mother's second husband, her stepfather. Astonishingly and tragically, he also dies in Nigeria very soon after they arrive. So once again, there is bereavement in the family. They come back to London, and this is when Rosemary really begins to think of herself. Even though she titles herself here as writer, it really begins to happen on their return to London. She starts hanging around in Soho, I suppose, feeling her way into the London literary set. And she publishes her first book at the age of 20, 1948, a children's book called On Wooden Wings. And she illustrated it as well. This is, I have read it, it's perfectly genial. I guess if it was to get published today, it would certainly be edited down a lot. Children's books tend to be a bit shorter these days, but it's It's a kind of a group of misfits who go on a long journey. They get carried away by a weathercock on top of a church, and it's quite an attractive piece of work. And some of the illustrations are nice to look at. But her life begins to change quite quickly. She gets married in 1949 to an engineer, Michael or Mickey Lightband. Now he takes her abroad. They go to India, where he has work. And in India, she has a serious illness. She has paratyphoid, which is, of course, similar typhoid, but is another kind of bacterial infection. She recovers from that, and they move to Karachi, where she contracts polio, and she is seriously ill. She is paralyzed for a while. There is what I'm sure was a very heartfelt account of somebody recovering from polio in her book, The Way Out of Berkeley Square. She does recover, though, and she has to come back to England on her own to do so. But she never quite gets back the feeling in her right hand. And she takes on the habit of wearing a black glove to cover what she felt was a certain deformity in that hand. Having recovered in England, her husband still in Pakistan, she goes to live in Paris. And this was an absolutely critical year, I think. Now thinking of herself as a writer, now a published writer, this was a real boost to her development. She seems to have spent a year or so there and is reunited with her husband, and they move to Hampstead in 1954. And this is when her career really gets going. Although I don't think she ever saw herself as part of a movement in that sense, she was certainly part of a literary circle. Lots of noisy dinner parties, lots of chat, lots of exchange of written material, and so on. And she begins to publish some of the work that I showed you on the slide earlier. In 1968, her mother dies, which is a massive shock, and her marriage collapses shortly afterwards. And these two events coming close together seem to have initiated what became a long, long journey of spiritual, psychological, emotional discovery. She runs through every kind of meditation, class, every variety of religion you could possibly think of. I suppose in some ways a very 1960s thing, certainly somebody who was very much on a quest for meaning. And like everything she did, this was done with peculiar intensity. So much so that in 1977 she actually gave herself severe eye damage from strenuous meditation exercises, which involve staring at bright lights and blank walls for long periods of time. And on the last day of 1977, she had to have an operation for 2 detached retinas. So her eyesight was always problematic, as you remember from the very beginning. This didn't do it any good at all. The operation saved her sight, but in some ways the cure was even worse than the condition itself, and she became virtually blind for the next 2 years. Now, up until this point, having published the major work that we have seen, she was still thinking about continuing as a writer. So she had been talking to a publisher about bringing out selected poems, and she had the complete manuscript of a new novel on her. But faced with this, faced with a sense of isolation, with the failure in many ways of her quest, she finds herself unable to cope on her own, and she moves out of London and goes to live with her mother's sister Dorothy in Bournemouth. And this is where she abandons the quest. She gives up searching and she turns to Christianity. She moves out from Dorothy's house and she gets herself a flat in Bournemouth, and she decides to completely turn her back on her previous life. So she takes on the name Mrs. Lightband, her married name, having previously used her maiden name throughout her writing career. She cuts herself off completely from her family, from her friends, and particularly from anybody involved in the literary industry or the publishing industry. She burnt the manuscript of the novel that she had completed, and she destroys her collection of more than 40 artistic treasures which she had gathered over the years to help her in her quest for inner meaning. And the notebooks describe this. She puts them in an incinerator, and the ones that don't burn, she smashes them to bits with a brick and then dumps them all. Having done all that and cleared away all the detritus of her previous life, she travels to Jerusalem and is baptized near the River Jordan in 1981 and begins her life again, or I guess as she would have said, began her life properly. And from then on, she lives alone in Bournemouth, but as Astley emphasises, she doesn't become a recluse. Her life becomes a kind of a drama where she needs to defend herself from what she sees as the slaves of Satan around her, which are trying to prevent her from getting close to God. But she doesn't just sit alone in a darkened room. She's travelling around from church to church. She travels regularly to Hyde Park, to Speaker's Corner, to give out Bibles. And towards the end of her life, she's even making friends in a hotel nearby where she goes occasionally for Sunday lunch. There is even a suggestion from letters that Astley discovers that she was beginning to open up channels of communication to her family, possibly looking towards some sort of reconciliation. But in fact, there is no time, because she dies on the 15th of April 2014, and she is buried in the village of Warblington in Hampshire near her mother. Now we've got that kind of outline. I just want to give that work, which is so rich in its diversity, some kind of shape for you. There's no question that the major impulse of all her writing, the thing that gives it its rhetorical drive, is its satire. And this is very wide-ranging. It goes the whole spectrum from the genial and comic to the profoundly bitter and cynical. And she delivers it in her own voice as an author, but she also gives it to the reader through her presentation of character. And everybody is a target. Londoners, everyone who is not a Londoner, young people, old people, the conventional, the unconventional, they are all come in for a bit of fun poking. And it's based on the acute observations of a poet, someone who can stand outside and spot the follies and foolishness of society. The itch of the malcontent runs right through her work. In Businessmen as Lovers, which is her frothiest and most insubstantial book in many ways, the central character in it says with a tone of astonishment, "I had no idea happiness was so pleasant. I've always lived as if it was more or less irrelevant." Rosemary Tonks never sought happiness. She sought meaning. And you see that absolutely throughout her work. So, when she puts on her satirical hat, and she's got it on almost all the time, how does that satire work? Well, she's quite keen occasionally, especially in her earlier work, for doing the kind of Swiftian thing, the commentary on society and how daft people are. So like this. This is in the first book, Opium Fogs. You remember I said someone had come back from India having been ill? This is Gabriella. She was fresh from the sophistication of Indian society, where people are still introduced to one another and converse together with a show of good humour, whereas in London, behaviour is altogether more primitive and down to earth. And yet again, same kind of thing. The European goes in terror of sincerity. He considers it the hallmark of a man without resources. The first of the natural gifts of genius is 1,000 a year. One suspects that there is a professional point in there somewhere. And she is clear-sighted to the point of cynicism. A poem and a love affair. These are the great illnesses between 19 and 30. Love is quite incidental to any successful relationship, whereas the courteous lie is indispensable. So that's her in her authorial persona, her overall voice, the voice of the narrator. But she also delivers her satire through the presentation of character. And she could do this because she is able to capture her characters so strongly and robustly that she can take a great big dig at them without making them seem ridiculous. Well, she makes them seem ridiculous without taking away their sense of being real. So they have their integrity while she also makes the satirical point about them. She is certainly very sensitive about the way that people posture and perform. They exaggerate themselves or play themselves for effect. So she says of the central character in the Bloater himself, he must have climbed on too many platforms, and men get this infection, this platformitis, much more easily than women. Well, she says, occasionally, my mother used to play at being my mother. That one hits home, obviously. Yeah. I think the way that the satire develops is it becomes more sophisticated in the sense that what you see in the later novels is a feeling that the characters themselves are being tongue-in-cheek, that they are able to, you can feel her writing complex characters who are able to perform but see themselves performing. Whereas in the early books, it's a little bit coarser in some ways. So there's a tang of bitterness about Opium Fogs, which is the first book, which I like quite a lot. But some of the characters are drawn, she allows them to be absurd. So one of the major characters in Opium Fogs is an embittered librarian who is absolutely eating his heart out with, he's particularly bitter because the young woman he was in love with is the woman who has gone to India and she's got married, but she has returned and he wants to have an affair with her. Above all, I need her so that I may lose all ambition. Never let me attain a position of petty authority in the world, so that I may remain master of myself, so that I may go on hating. But that becomes something altogether lighter in The Bloater, and in some ways more sophisticated. I was at this point going to read you out a little bit, but you know, I think I'm going to leave that for you to enjoy when you buy The Bloater yourself. But there are a couple of discussions in it between the central character Min and her best friend Jenny, who is a wonderful character, where they are working on something like sono montage, and they go out and get drunk and talk about their love affairs in a London pub, and the dialogue is crisp and funny and absolutely wonderfully realised. So I'm going to leave that joy to you and move on to a particular subset of her satirical writing, which is that of the iconoclast. This is someone who wants to smash things, overturn the accepted order and make it new. Diary of a Rebel. For my fierce, hot-blooded sulkiness, I need the cafe, where old mats of paper lace catch upon coat sleeves that are brilliant with the nap of idleness, and the cant of the meat fly is eternal. On the window is the milk of lazy breath, and the coal cart rumbles, with huge purses full of dust and narcotics for the masses. Sin pricks me like a convict's suit of arrows, for here my evil, blue and moody youth has found its old lair. At the bottom of the soiled path, in the bed of stinging nettles that are splashed with wood milk and have every hair upon them raised to strike. There is no trade can lure me out with bundle, noose and feeding bag. I know that fate has graves to fill in daily life, and the jargon of the meat fly's leaded wing to put to sleep the citizen employed in keeping worms at bay by breathing. In the prose works, in the novels, this rebellion is never wholly consistently serious. So in The Halt During the Chase, one of the characters says, "Isn't buying new lampshades a form of slow death?" But it's very much a part of the narrative arc of these central figures who dominate the novels. At the beginning of The Way Out of Berkeley Square, the person telling the story says, first sentence, "I'm 30 and I'm stuck." So this is very much the narrative drift. This is what happens in the books. And there's no question what the rebellion is against, what is the target. Her most persistent character type is that of the controlling older man. There's one in all the novels. In Opium Fogs, there's Dr. Swingler, who is a landlord. In Emir, there's Eugene, who is a kind of mentor to the young woman at the centre of the book. There's the Bloater, in the Bloater, of course. There are a whole range of men to choose from in Businessmen as Lovers. There is a ghastly father in The Way Out of Berkeley Square, and there is the odious Philip in The Halt During the Chase. So how do the young women in the books contend with these controlling men? Well, strategies for escape include falling in love with somebody else, of course, deceit, or most interestingly, becoming a writer. So in Emir, this Eugene, who I described as a mentor, he's a particularly unpleasant type of mentor in the sense that he is trying to shape this young woman into being a kind of amusing toy that he can talk to. But she frees herself from him by showing him her manuscript of poems. And he finds them so disgustingly immoral and obscene that he refuses to see her ever again. So I quite like that narrative arc. I thought it really, really worked. And in The Way Out of Berkeley Square, this ghastly father who dominates the book, she gets the two children who are subject to him, and it's like she splits off the possible destinies of how you react to a controlling parent like that. So the man, who is Michael, he's the one who escapes to India to become a poet. Surprise. And it's the girl, it's the woman who stays to keep house for the father. She's called Arabella, but she's not even allowed a name, as everybody calls her Pigeon. And here, Tonks sort of sorts out, she polarizes the kind of responses to an older man like this. Safety or danger. Commerce, because Arabella at home, although she is locked into this horrible father-daughter relationship, she has absolutely everything she wants. So there's commerce, success, financial success, and art, and there's the family, or there's solitude. These kind of roads which have diverged. And the crisis of the book comes when these two children get back together. Almost like the two destinies join again, and they rebel against the father. What she does is she she's concealed the fact that Michael has got polio in India until she just can't do it anymore. And then she presents her father with all the letters where he's described his symptoms, his illness, and his recovery. When he's finished the letters, he looks at me. It's a look I shan't forget. The sort of look that tells you you've never really known someone. It comes from the back of the head where the thoughts are very dark. It tells me that I've lost his love. And he knows now that he lost mine years ago. Suddenly I learn things about father like lightning. In 10 minutes or half an hour, everything will be understood and forgiven. Perhaps we shall love each other more in a new way, but I cannot be sure. And meanwhile, I am growing up. Of course, this is very much part of what the 1960s called the sex war. And I think generally Tonks will allow that to become apparent through the action of the narrative and the behaviour of the characters in her books. But just occasionally she will genderise the argument, she will underline that, like this in The Halt During the Chase. Wherever we went, Philip was always in command, responsible for everything. I had never been so much at the centre of society, ready to give my name and address and my views on the latest news at a moment's notice. Life with Philip meant lectures, concerts, club dinners, theatres, cinemas, small parties, hard work, a firm mind and non-stop lovemaking. And this, to me, unbearably ordinary world of his was made not only bearable but magical on account of his beauty and energy. I was so proud of him, but his way of life was emphatically a man's way of life. It was too male for me, and it was wearing me out. So you won't be surprised to see that my next category leads on from this idea of rebellion. So in the novels especially, but also in the poetry as well, the tone might be satirical, but what drives the plot is sex and sexual identity. Who does one sleep with? And how much does it matter anyway? So with the exception of Businessmen as Lovers, where the tone is farcical, it's a farce, and therefore this issue is spread throughout a whole number of couples, English couples who are on holiday. These questions are focused much more intensively on the behaviour and inner thoughts of a single female protagonist. Now this, of course, is very much part of the period. I think it's wonderfully neat that Rosemary Tonks' first book of poems and her first novel were published in Philip Larkin's Annus Mirabilis of 1963. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. I think that Larkin's famous verse here, where he issues his slightly sort of wry disclaimer, he must have thought when he read Tonks's work that that's what he was being shut out from, that Tonks and Tonks's world was where the sexual revolution was happening. And of course, there is a technological point to be made here, because life was changing, particularly for young women. Although it's perhaps slightly more complicated than we might at first glance think. So the pill is around. It's been in the United States for a while. It appears on the NHS in 1961. So remember, Rosemary is already a published author then, but her first adult books do not come out till 63. But as you can see, it is not freely available to single women until 1974. Now, there are all kinds of dodges. Having done a little bit of research on the use of the pill in the 60s, all kinds of dodges that women got up to in order to get free access to the pill. But strictly speaking, it's not till 74 that you could just ask for it and get it if you weren't married. So I think in many ways, when we look at Tonks's novels, certainly, she's using this discourse. This is going on in society. What does this mean for the way we live? To imagine what life might now be like with these possibilities. So there's a certain amount of breaking convention in the books relating to sex and sexual matters. So Min says in The Bloater, people specialise in telling me I'm difficult. Lots of George's friends, that's her husband, lots of George's friends literally save this up as the only thing that will give them any pleasure over a winter weekend. Now I'll just go round there for a cup of tea so that I can explain to Min what a difficult sort of woman she is. And there's a certain amount of truth-telling going on, the sense that here is a young woman pushing the men off the stage and grabbing the limelight in order to say things that need to be said. So again, Min says, you know, the beastly thing about sex is the steady, relentless gloom of the men. They just lose all sense of humour. There's definitely a strong suspicion of male performance in the novels. Min in The Bloater talks about something she calls the dancing routine, which is a reference to King David in the Old Testament dancing in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And it's an interesting reference because he is spotted. He is seen by Michal, who is the daughter of Saul. And she thinks he looks a bit of a prat, really. And as the Bible says, despised him in her heart. And for that, she is punished by never being able to have children. So it's an interesting thing for Min to introduce at that point. Tonks herself, despite this discourse and her obvious involvement with it, was very prickly about being pushed into or towards any kind of movement or political group. In interviews, she always got really cross when she felt that was happening. What makes her distinctive is the position she's working out here, where her sense of what sex might be like when it's characterised only by free choice. In other words, without regard to fears of biology, biological anxiety, or indeed worrying about morality either. In other words, sleeping with who you want to rather than with who you think you ought to. And over again, what you get from her is a fear that pleasure, sex will be so nice that it'll make you fall in love. And that's the essential anxiety at the heart of the journey of a lot of her young women. It's the poet speaking. It's the persuasive world of the senses. So she says, this is Min again in the Bloater. She's got this really close mate who is Billy, but he says something that makes her think that they're going to become more than friends. And this is what she says. Now we can never go back, and we both know it. When we get to the bottom of the hill and reach that little group of trees, Billy will kiss me. And I shall begin to think and to long and to be jealous. My peace of mind and my gaiety will be gone forever. I shall have to be balanced and to keep my heart strong, to fight and to be catty and to reinvent my arrogance all over again by an effort of will. It's almost too much. My much prized, friendly, reliable Billy will turn into a male whose flesh will keep me awake at night, and I shall have no one to phone up and complain to when he makes me unhappy. It really is the limit. This is one of the things that makes her final novel, The Halt During the Chase, so interesting. Now, in that title, she definitely, I am sure, meant us to understand the chase as being a sexual thing, the hunt for a sexual partner. The great drama of the novel, and what makes it different from her other books, is that in this book, the chase is not towards any other individual, away from the controlling over man. The chase becomes inward. So Sophie, who is the main character in that book, she escapes from Philip, she escapes to France. So far, so usual, that's what normally happens in a Tonks novel. But Philip pursues her. So he goes to France with her. Sophie goes to a kind of retreat. So it's a family she knows about who live in the middle of nowhere in France. It's beautifully described, empty, enormous house where she's alone until Philip comes after her. But Philip is completely out of his depth. And there's a wonderful description about a dog that's also part of the household. And this dog has at least equal status of any of the human beings in the house. And it's a major character in the book. And it spots Philip immediately for what he is. So at one point, they go out for a walk, and the dog is called Ayu, and he's with them all. And she says, "I thought Ayu was going to revolt when Philip threw a ball for him, but he just gave him a thoughtful look and then trotted after it at a moderate speed. I noticed Philip only did it once. There is nothing more ego-destroying than throwing a ball for a dog which remains calmly by your side, wondering what on earth you are doing." And the importance of that episode is that what happens is that during the evening, when they've all eaten, they disperse into this huge house, and they have separate bedrooms. And Sophie goes to her room and shuts the door, and she starts reading a book about Zen meditation. And she hears the footsteps down the corridor. And Philip comes to her door and he tries the door, and she's locked it. He knocks on the door, he says, "Sophie, Sophie." And she says, she doesn't get up. "I lay there triumphantly, eating horrid darkness, locked to my book of magic. I felt like Ayu, refusing to run after the ball. I am not your sexual doggy-woggy." Yes. So, this is really interesting, of course, especially in terms of what happens in Rosemary's life when, in the late 70s, she does turn inward, which, of course, raises the issue of what we think about her as an artist. Surely never was any recent writer, so self-consciously, committedly an artist. She had a sense of mission. She'd been writing since childhood. She was aware of her heritage. She was aware of her position in the London scene. So the obvious question is, what was her heritage? What did she think about the influences upon her writing? Now, when she was asked about this in interview, she said, practically all French literature. And then later on she says, "I find French 19th century literature tremendously exciting and inspiring." So how does this emerge in her work? Now, I'm not really qualified to follow her very far into French literature, but I know a little bit about this guy. And anyone who has read a little bit of Charles Baudelaire will recognize his influence throughout her poetry. Now, Baudelaire published a book called Les Fleurs du Mal in 1857, or The Flowers of Evil. He, his publisher, and his printer were immediately prosecuted for obscenity, and over many subsequent difficult years of toing and froing, suppressing certain material, releasing others, the book is eventually released generally to become extremely influential on the continent, but not so much across the Channel, unless you're talking about Rosemary Tonks. So what can we find in her work that gain strength from what she read in Baudelaire's work? Well, the first thing is setting. Baudelaire is very much a poet of the city, of an urban setting. In fact, he's really important because he's someone who imports the romantic sensibility into the filth of the city. So he makes it okay for the poet of the senses to turn their back on the lakes and the mountains and to get into the gutter. That truth can be there too. And that's essential for the way Tonks looks at her writing and her existence in the city. So there's the urban setting. Second thing is Baudelaire is absolutely a modern. Now, this is a pretty slippery term. What on earth do we mean by modern? And in fact, people often turn to Baudelaire to talk about, to define what we mean by modernity. He wrote a really important essay about an artist called Constantin Guy, who was an illustrator really for magazines, which was called The Painter of Modern Life. And in there, Baudelaire says, by modernity, I mean the ephemeral, the fugitive, the contingent, the half of art whose other half is the eternal and immutable. Now, he often gets quoted as somehow depicting art as being something throwaway. You write it now and it's gone. But that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that the modern gets inspiration from what is ephemeral and will disappear 5 minutes from now, tomorrow, next week. But what the artist makes out of that is eternal and immutable. And that's absolutely the way Tonks thinks. So there's a wonderful metaphor in the halt during the chase. You remember Philip pursues Sophie to France. And one of the ways which he looks out of place, Sophie says, Philip's French was frightful. The curious thing about it was the frightfulness was catching. Philip infected me and I began to slow down and conjugate verbs. Everything became conditional. Where was the fluid, slipshod present tense we had been living in? So there's the urban setting, there's the modernity, the sense of being modern. Third thing is there's the persona of the poet. Now in French, this is the word flaneur, which in English often gets translated as loafer. The poet is a loafer in the city. I think that never quite captures it. The problem with the word loafer is it makes us think of laziness. And when we think of laziness, we think of being disengaged. But the flaneur, the poet, is absolutely engaged thoroughly in the life of the city. They're just somehow not part of the life of the city. They're both at once. They are there everywhere, but they're not involved. They're out looking, the flaneur. That is very much Tonks' stance. And finally, Baudelaire is really important in beginning a road towards what becomes known as surrealism. Now, this is something that really doesn't cross the channel particularly well, but becomes very influential in France and certainly affects the way Tonks writes. It comes about because of the intense commitment of the poet to depict the face of things, the reality of the world, to sense it in all its various dimensions. Something so intense that ironically it becomes disorientating. And you're so much in the moment that it actually transports you somewhere else. It's transcendent. So in a poem called Exotic Fragrance, Baudelaire writes, when I, with shuttered eyes on a warm autumn night, inhale the stunning fragrance of your warm embrace, I see the blissful shores of an exotic place, illumined by an ardent sun's unchanging light. So the here and now is so strong it takes us somewhere else. So here's Tonks in her most Baudelaire manner. This is not the whole poem, it's just a little bit. I knew the poet's rag-soft eyelid was the gutter's fee for the way down to life. I had my lodgings in that quarter of the city like a cat's ear full of cankered passages where November wraps the loiterer as spiders do their joints. My gutter, how you gleamed, like dungeon floors which cobras have lubricated. Your time was kept in slimy yawns while you prized up the warm roof of the poor man's shoe and lacquered it with mire, that the grave might find a way into its meat. Meanwhile, the fool readored his face, green as a toad seen in a rippling crack of rain. The grave, whose grunt lifts the latch, whose leavings found at night upon my flank were as black bread and smoked like Satan's droppings. Oh, heaven was greedy at my nostril, dark as a violet, to draw out her own breath from my brute, freeze it with winter while I slept, and with it bolt me to the ground in linen and diamond. Okay, so final chapter. Here's our key question. Can we claim her? Is she one of ours? I thought about this quite a lot, and it seems to me that when we look at those themes that I picked out for you there, the indignation of the satirist, someone who is outside but sees you clearly enough to point out your faults, the revolt and the rejection of the rebel, the struggle of the lover who sees their identity disappearing into the identity of the person who is loved, and then being transported by an intoxication promoted by the artist. All of these things have a kind of feeling of alienation, a feeling of not being in the self, but beside the self. Even in her lighter moments, her lighter books, we get this idea of not being inside one's own existence, but next to it. So in The Way Out of Berkeley Square, somebody says, you don't suppose there's time in a lifetime to have a life, do you? Certainly not. And in Businessmen and Lovers, there's an exchange which runs, tell me, how is everyone back in London? I suppose it's the same mud puddle of flatfish and newts. More or less, people being lived by their lives. And in a poem called Running Away, Tonks writes, I was a guest at my own youth. This is so persistent, and there so often, you have to wonder where it comes from. And I think it's a London thing, or to be more exact, I think it's a not being in London thing. I think this is part of all of our culture. If this area around us here, these few miles, are your home, I think at some point in our lives we always feel that shadow of that monster on the horizon. Now, I wasn't born in Gillingham, but I was born in a distant London suburb and grew up in Sussex. And I went back to live in London at exactly the age Tonks was when she returned from Lagos and started hanging around in Soho. And I remember the absolute intoxication of being in the big city as a young person, but I always felt like I was from somewhere else. And I think Tonks does too. And her art, in many ways, is a commentary on that condition. And we might even say that that feeling of being outside oneself as one is living one's life actually leads to the central crisis of her life and her search for meaning in the unalienated, unaltered self, which of course leads to failure and destruction. Certainly as far as Neil Astley is concerned, a woeful act of willful literary destruction. And of course, in many ways, I absolutely agree with that. I would love to have seen that final manuscript that went on the bonfire. But then sometimes, I think about that, and it occurs to me that maybe Mrs. Lightband, those last 30 years of her life, although she wasn't writing, she was somehow finding her way back to the artist she had been, because it was a turning back towards the world, away from the self, back to the way that the poet had addressed the world when she had been a young woman. It's just that towards the end of her life, the world was not a route to art. The world became a gigantic machine which God was using to tell her about his love for her. I think Tonks was always on the side of life, of what Baudelaire called the fantastic reality of life, a life that was perceived so acutely and so intensely, it was transcendental in itself. She said a really interesting thing, one of my favourite of her quotes in one of her interviews. She says, if you are a person, in addition to being a well-read person, then you can cure your reading with your life. In the end, for Rosemary Tonks, I think life won. But she wouldn't have been half the artist she was if she hadn't also been the person who could make that victory possible. And of course, I'm going to let her have the final word. This is Addiction to an Old Mattress. No, this is not my life, thank God, worn out like this and crippled by brain fag, obsessed first by one person and then almost at once most horribly besotted by another. These Februaries full of drafts and cracks, they belong to the people in the streets, the others out there, haberdashers, writers of menus. Salt breezes, bolsters from Istanbul, barometers full of contempt, controlling moody isobars. Sumptuous tittle-tattle from a summer crowd that's fed on lemonades and matinees. And seas that float themselves about from place to place and then spend hours just moving some clear sleets across glass stones. Yalta, deck chairs in Asia's gold cake, thrones. Meanwhile, I live on, powerful, disobedient, inside their drafty haberdasher's climate with these people who are going to obsess me. Potatoes, dentists, people I hardly know. It's unforgivable, for this is not my life, but theirs that I am living. And I wolf, bolt, gulp it down day after day. Rosemary Tonks, thank you for listening.
What an astonishing talk. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Now what we're going to do is we're going to have a performance from Lizzie, a short excerpt from The Bloater, followed by 3 poems. But this is Lizzie Partridge, a Medway creative and actor.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. With kind thanks to Penguin Random House UK for permission to share excerpts from The Bloater by Rosemary Tonks, reissued May 2022. Chapter 1. Hello! This is Fritz coming into the darkened hall and calling out uncertainly. He says that hello more or less to himself. Sometimes, if I'm there, I answer after a long half-minute. Yes, I'm coming down. The point is that it's 2:15 in the afternoon, and I've just thrown myself down on the bed with a form of tiredness which is like drunkenness. Your head goes on reeling, and there are varied layers of brand new tiredness inside the massive overall exhaustion, so that you go on falling through one after another. If you lie there long enough, you reach the bottom, the ocean floor. Once deep down there, flat out in the pitch darkness, half buried in your bed and your thoughts, once down there, someone calls out, "Hello," with German-sounding syllables, and you instantly take an extra half-minute of darkness and oblivion before letting yourself drift up to the surface and calling out, just as you hit the surface, in a voice of authority with a sparkle of asti spumante, "All right, I'm coming." I know perfectly well he'll go on standing there if I don't answer. He likes to register the atmosphere with his head bent a little, listening in case there are surprises in the way of people or objects. Also, he sniffs. He sniffs the house to see what I've been up to. If it's got a dried up smell like old twigs, he thinks, "Oh, she's been working. We'll have to call an ambulance." If there's a whiff of scent, I've got a little bottle of light brown scent which only lasts 20 minutes on the skin but will stay on my coat in the hall for 2 days, he thinks, "Parties. Just my luck to be a poor student while others are getting out, enjoying sex, life and heaven knows what." Very, very occasionally, there's a smell of silicone polish which has been put on by me, in which case he pretends to be hurt. "You want to take my job away?" That's no good. "The matter is that you are taking my work." In any case, you can't please him. Everything I do is disgraceful, fascinating. He has very strong views about women. They can never win. They will get hits. In reality, he is kind, long-suffering, just, and good-natured. Today, there's a smell of polish, but Fritz could never guess the reason for it, and I don't think I could tell him, not without exploding with laughter. The polish went on that little African stool in the sitting room, not because I look after it with care, in fact, I only polish the top of it. It went on because a huge man was sitting on the sofa, with his legs stuck out halfway across the room. This huge, tame, exotic man was reading his book as though he was sitting in an airport lounge, with no more regard for me than one has for the factotum in tinted nylon uniform pyjamas who brings a cup of coffee and wipes over the simulated marble formica with a morsel of rubber skin. Not content with ignoring me, this loafer, this self-regarding bloater, smells. Oh yes, he does. I personally can smell him from the kitchen door. I'm not interested in finding excuses for him. I do see that he is large and washing takes time. I do see that he spends most of his life travelling or appearing in a professional capacity. He's a singer, a baritone. Even so, it's monstrous of him. In addition to this, he irritates me more than any man I've ever met. There are times when he turns up bearing some sort of gift, "This only makes me angrier," and follows me to and fro, helping. I've got a feeling that bed making is his speciality. The only time I've ever seen him hurry is in the direction of the bedroom. The bed I'm making up is usually for him when he spends the night with us. And until the moment he enters it, the bedroom is only a very ordinary room with a bed in it. Then suddenly, snap pull, it's a boudoir. It's a dangerous liaison. It's the 4th floor of a Lisbon brothel. It's Madame du Pompadour and Louis XV all over again in some unaired voluptuary's den, the horrible Bourbon temperament, etc., before she gave the affair style and order. This man wanders along the side of the bed, still carrying his dispatch case and wet umbrella, while I tuck in the back blankets and snap at him. Sometimes I'm flooded with a diabolical strength and feel almost capable of throwing him out of the window, dispatch case, umbrella, reading book, voice, ego, and all. I think he feels this, but instead of staggering back when he senses my flood of malice, he goes on smiling. He laps it up, and the room becomes more of a bedroom than ever. The polish was simply another piece of self-protective malice. He throws all my evil qualities into relief, and I'm perpetually convulsed with hysteria at my own actions, which become more and more outrageous. I went into the kitchen and I took up the tin. You open it with that old-fashioned screw at the side. The wax is mauve, slippery, fragrant. It smells as good as fresh white gum oozing out of a tree of rosin. I found a polishing rag, and with these 2 rough objects, I was ready for him. He was still sitting there. He has a way of watching me with the whites of his eyes and without moving, and the stool has been pitched off centre by the thrust of his legs. The curious thing is that he never shows any sign of surprise. Anyone else surely would have been uneasy to see a woman with set lips enter the room, kneel down and polish away remorselessly at a stool. And this was about 6:30 in the evening. I think he gave me a glance as a concession to our relationship, and then simply went on reading, exactly as though it was fit and proper for me to go about my lowly household tasks while he rested his baritone on the sofa. You see what kind of man he is. Still, the room smelt much better by the time I'd finished, and I had taken a limited form of vengeance on him. I know how painters feel when they refer in a special tone to their sitters. There's always a bad feeling against the one who sits. A grudge builds up. Impossible to explain all this to Fritz about my exotic bloater, who smells like a bloater and has to be counselled out with silicone polish. He is exotic in spite of all of this. There's a loose red silk handkerchief with green spots which falls out of his top pocket, and a tie which matches and is silkily knotted off just to the left, under the wing of the collar. For the top button of the shirt has gone or been wrenched off, and you can see the throat down to its roots and the beginning of the gigantic white marble of his chest. How it stays white is a mystery. This throat is not unattractive, and it contains his great prize, the cause of the overbearing arrogance in his step, his voice. I haven't actually heard it, because even the least sound from him, anything like an exhaust pipe humming, makes me stiffen up. And for once, he's noticed this and has the sense to keep quiet. I imagine he could reverberate like an organ pipe, and if he held a low C in the sitting room, the claustrophobia would be unbearable. As it is, the reading, the sitting, and the whites of the eyes are more than enough. Fritz says, "The matter is that you have been polishing and doing things, and that is not good." Don't be silly. I saved the downstairs lavatory for you, so you can look forward to that. Don't tell me I'm not generous, Fritz. How are you, by the way? Oh, not too bad. We are doing Othello at school. He means the language school. And I am to write on his wife, Desdemona. Not so easy in a foreign language. You have to say what kind of woman is this Desdemona, and she's not so good. Oh, Fritz, not again. Please don't have such a down on women just because you had one bad love affair. It's not a case of that. I tell you, you find them out. They are just animals, these women. I was with a girl the other night, and you know, she was going on and on. He has gone very black in the face and is holding the hammer-headed bit of the vacuum cleaner. And I said, why not? And she would not, you know. She just turns round and says no. And why shouldn't she, for God's sake? Because she goes on, and that is the matter. She goes on too far, and then it's too late, and then she wants to stop. Well, why don't you stop, Fritz? Because man is the hunter, that is why. The woman knows, she knows when it's time to stop. What? You're telling me a little girl of 17 with no experience knows better than you, the great Fritz, an experienced seducer of women? He begins to laugh. He has a very helpless, infectious laugh. After all, he's 22 and everything is more or less amusing. He only puts on his black face for women, religion and politics. He has no idea that he is one of the most moral, most courteous people I have ever met. He is still determined to justify himself in case of the girl who went on. They know, he says with the primitive vigour of a secret Bible reader escaping from an age of psychoanalysis. It's built into them right from the beginning. Oh, Fritz, I have never heard anything so selfish. You know what? You're picking up the morality of the pavement and finding it very convenient. Now do stop it. It's not natural to you. You're going against your nature, and it doesn't suit you. Listen. If you're so tough, do you want to take some of the rugs outside and beat them? He agrees. We carry out soft, dusty Persian rugs where they make an amber vapour halfway down the sunlight on the little back lawn. Fritz enjoys carrying out specific tasks, and he likes to have his briefing in advance like an officer at the front. Then he bites on his pipe and fulfills a mission to the last word. It's true, he's also vague and will leave pieces of furniture stranded out in the middle of the room. But that's only because once cleaned, they have no reality for him. And he gets dazed when it comes to arranging a room. You have to wheel the heavy chairs back into their predestined positions and just twist a jug round or ease a rug back onto its seabed. It's much better even so than having someone who forcibly arranges things for you so that everything in the house is somehow running against the grain. I'm not going to the electronic studio this afternoon. I'm supposed to be preparing my tapes for tomorrow. In reality, I shan't do a thing. I'll have tea with Fritz and we'll talk about communism, the good idea that went wrong. After communism, he drives the vacuum down the first floor passage, making it snarl on the wooden boards on either side of the runner and pushing it up into the corners where it moans and raises its voice. When I can't stand it any longer, I come halfway upstairs and put on a desperate face and make overlarge gestures. Please, Fritz! He can't hear me coming on account of the din he's making and gives a start and touches his heart in the wrong place. Mein Tomater! That's what it sounds like. I've got to finish this piece. I swear to stick to women and keep off communism in the future. But one forgets and gets careless and interested. These poems are chosen from Bedouin of the London Evening, collected poems by Rosemary Tonks, published by Blood Axe Books 2014, shared with kind permission from Blood Axe Books. Story of a hotel room. Thinking we were safe. Insanity. We went in to make love. All the same idiots to trust the little hotel bedroom. Then in the gloom. And who does not know that pair of shutters with all the awkward hook on them, all screeching whispers? Very well then. In the gloom we set about acquiring one another, urgently, but on a temporary basis, only as guests, just guests of one another's senses. But idiots, to feel so safe, you hold back nothing because the bed of cold electric linen happens to be illicit. To make love as well as that is ruinous. Londoner, Parisian, someone should have warned us that without permanent intentions, you have absolutely no protection. If the act is clean, authentic, sumptuous, the concurring deep love of the heart follows the naked work, profoundly moved by it. Badly chosen lover. Criminal, you took a great piece of my life, and you took it under false pretenses. That piece of time, in the clear muscles of my brain, I have the lens and jug of it. Books, thoughts, meals, days and houses, half Europe spent like a coarse banknote. You took it, leaving mud and cabbage stumps. And criminal, I damn you for it, very softly. My spirit broke her fast on you, and Turk, you fed her with the breath of your neck. In my brain's clear retina, I have the stolen love behaviour. Your heart, greedy and tepid, brothel meat, gulped it like a flunky with erotica. And very softly, criminal, I damn you for it. The Flaneur and the Apocalypse. For his inebriated tread, the whole of Europe, with its great streets full of air and shade, its students and cocottes and traffic roughly caked with blood, is not enough. The whole of Europe put to sleep by music, coal fires, snow and cafe life, and suffocated by hot fog and poppies, and rocked by lovers like a chest of breath, is not, for the Flaneur, drug strong enough. A Europe, motionless with dust and night, as if a squid her bag had emptied, as if a doormat had been shaken all over it, is not mysterious enough for his infatuated tread. The Furies are modern. They don't drive you. They entice with cafes, lovers, dusty streets. With the apocalypse. Not this one, but the next, they hiss. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you everyone for your attendance tonight. Thank you, Jeremy, for that dashing, brilliant talk. Absolutely. I'll never look at Rosemary the same way again. I'd like to thank Lizzie for her amazing performance. Thank you, Sam, for your support and for turning up. I'd like to thank the staff and the friends of Medway Libraries, Nazrin, Emily, Sheila and Joe. I'd like to thank Piers for making the recording. Thank you to Vintage and to Blood Axe Books for giving us the permission for sharing Rosemary's words tonight. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for watching. Thank you and good night.